Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm going to be looking at everything I do in preparation for a flight in Microsoft Flight Simulator. That's going to include steps to prepare the flight plan as well as the airplane, and a few things that you would also do in the game that you wouldn't do in reality, because at the end of the day you're working with software and not a physical plane. There are some great external tools that you can use for flight planning, but my approach sticks to what's available in the game, and I complement a little bit with what you can find very easily on Google. The technique I use gives me the desired realism I'm looking for from the game, but it definitely doesn't reflect all the checks you would have to do in real life. I'll also cover how I select an airplane, and once I've loaded the airplane, I'll also show you a few little things that I like to configure before taking off on my flight. I decided to put this video together because I think that for most casual simmers, this approach is sufficiently realistic, but I'll let you tell me in the comments what you think of it. The first thing I do is I figure out where I want to fly. The beauty of this game is that you can fly absolutely anywhere, and I really try to force myself to fly in different places on every flight now, as well as somewhere where I maybe haven't been before, and it also has enhanced scenery for it. One of the easiest ways to make sure you end up flying somewhere with nice scenery is to fly in one of the locations that has had a world update applied to it. As of right now, there are 5 different areas that have had world updates where you can see a fairly significant difference in the rendering. You have to download the world updates separately from the marketplace, so go make sure that you have it downloaded, installed, and up to date. The easiest way to find them is to just go into the marketplace and just type in the world at the top of the search box and they should come right up. Once I've chosen a general location for my flight from the installed world updates, I'll start to zoom in a little bit to get a better idea and choose a more specific area. I generally try and find local airports to fly out of rather than using the larger national or international airports, just to keep it a little bit more realistic. The preparation that I'm showing you right now is for a VFR flight, which is what I do around 99% of the time. I still end up creating a very lightweight flight plan just so that I have something to help keep track of my progress as I'm moving through the flight. I usually don't always follow it to the letter, and I'll end up deviating if I see something interesting that I want to go check out. Setting up a VFR flight plan is a lot simpler than trying to set up an instrument flight. I tend to keep it as simple as choosing a departure point and then choosing an arrival point and then just adding a couple of waypoints in the middle. So in this case, I've got a flight path from Antwerp going through Brussels and just landing on the outskirts of Brussels. So I'll end up just adding a couple more waypoints right here for the different points that are of interest. And I'll add a few here in Brussels as well, just to make it a little bit longer. There we go. I like adding the points of interest to my flight plan just to make it a little bit easier to follow and know where to look for certain things. I'll also generally have a look and make sure that there's an alternate airfield somewhere along the way of my flight path that I can deviate to if I decide to cut the flight short. In this case, the only realistic alternate is probably Brussels National here, and there's also a very small little airport right here. Since Sim Update 5 came out, I actually ended up re-recording just this little bit of the video because there's been one major change to the flight planning screen. By default, it's going to be showing in satellite view. This is actually super cool because I used to duck out of Flight Sim and go over to Google Maps to have an idea of where I was going to be flying. But now that it's integrated to the game, I can actually make a much more interesting flight path inside of the game. For example, there's a river that runs pretty much from Antwerp all the way down, it thins out a little bit, all the way past Brussels. Instead of just having this direct flight path from Antwerp all the way down to my waypoint to the west of Brussels, I'm actually going to modify my flight plan so it follows the river instead. To do that, all I do is I click on where I want to add a waypoint and I click add. There are some bugs to be aware of with adding custom waypoints though. Sometimes when I'm going to click on the map and I'm going to want to go to add, the white box that's outlining the add button won't appear, and if I press on add, nothing's going to happen. I'm not quite sure what's causing that, but an easy way to fix it that I found is to just go back to the main menu and then come back into the world map, and it should be okay. And now I've got a nice flight plan that I can either follow with the GPS, or if I want to fly a little bit more visually, I can just follow these different rivers all the way down to Brussels. I'm still going to need my GPS though to be able to find my way to my destination airport, since there aren't really any landmarks between my final point of interest and my destination. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in, especially on my arrival airport, but on the departure airport as well, just to have a general idea of what I'm getting myself into. In particular, I'm looking to see if there's any landmarks I can use sort of when I'm flying that I can figure out where the airfield is, and also where it is relative to the city or town that's nearby. It's going to make it a whole lot easier on you because you're going to have a general idea of what you should be looking for as you're arriving, rather than just flying into an area that you aren't familiar with at all. The other thing to keep in mind is to see if you see any actual elevation changes. It can be a little bit hard to tell, but you can see right here that it looks like there's some kind of mountain. If I do see some elevation changes, I'm actually going to head over onto SkyVector to check out the sectional charts to see what the altitudes of those different mountains are. It's possible that if those mountains are in the direct flight path that I'm planning to use, I might have to adjust my flight plan accordingly. While I'm there, I'm also going to click on the arrival airport and I'm going to jot down the altitude and the runway headings of the airport that I'm going to be arriving at. This is going to affect how I approach the airport. Specifically, I'll be looking at how to enter the traffic pattern for landing. Before I move on, I do want to remind you, if you do get some value out of this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section below. The next thing I do is select the airplane that I want to fly with. Depending on the flight or tutorial that I'm planning for that week, I'm going to try and pick an airplane that's going to give me all the features that I need to demonstrate what I'm looking for. There are also a few other criteria that I'll end up using for just a regular flight. The first of those is the distance that I'm going to be traveling. For shorter flights, I might use a propeller-based airplane, either the Cub or one of the Cessnas, or if I'm looking to get there a little bit quicker, I might think about using the Diamond DA62, which is a particular favorite of mine. For a slightly longer journey, or if I'm going to be at very high altitudes, I'll end up going with one of the turboprops instead. My favorite of the turboprops is definitely the Cessna 208. Think of it like a larger version of the Cessna 172 with more horsepower and a higher cruising altitude. The TBM 930 is a lot of fun to fly as well, but it's a lot more difficult to fly than the Cessna 208, so beware. I did put together a video on flying the TBM with a few tips on how to make things a little bit easier. You can check that out. I'll add a link to it in the video. Finally, I'll also consider the weather that I'm flying in. If I'm going to be flying in light winds, the propeller-based airplanes are going to be okay, but once you get past something like 12 to 15 knots, you're probably better off looking at a turboprop, because it's going to be just that little bit bigger and a little bit more stable in strong winds. And of course, if I'm going to be flying in bad weather, I'll often select the Cessna 208 or the TBM just because they have the integrated weather systems. It comes in really handy when you're trying to avoid the worst of a rainstorm. Once I've selected my plane, I'm also going to collect a little bit of information about the plane that I'm flying. At minimum, I want to know the airspeeds and the different configurations that I need to be aware of to fly the airplane in each of the different segments of flight. So for takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, and approach, I'll collect the information like you can see on the table that I'm showing you right now. I found this little cheat sheet that I create myself for these airplanes to be super useful and a great reference for when you're flying. It makes it so much easier to fly the airplane because you can configure it exactly like you've written down, and the airplane is effectively just going to fly itself. If you want to know how I derived these numbers, you can check out the previous video that I did on how to fly any airplane smoothly. I'll add another link to that one right above me as well. With all of that done, I'm ready to jump into the cockpit. Once the flight's loaded up, there's a few things that I like to set up in the cockpit before I even taxi. The first thing obviously is to get the airplane running, and that's where you have a few options. Oftentimes if I'm in a hurry, I'm just going to use the Control-E shortcut, which is going to get the airplane running and started for me. On the other hand, if you do want to start the airplane yourself and you don't want to use the shortcut, but you're not familiar with the airplane, there is a really easy fix for that. In the menu, there is an option for the checklist. If you bring that up, it's going to show you all the steps you have to follow to get the airplane running. For example, the first thing I need to do to get the Cessna 208 running is to set the fuel selectors to on. Now, if you have no idea where that control is, it can be a little bit annoying to look around for it, but there is a nice little shortcut here. You can click on the little eye, and it's going to show you where those options are. It's even highlighted them for me, so at this point, all I have to do is turn them both to on. From there, if you want to continue and start the airplane manually, you just keep walking through all of the different steps to get the engine running, and at that point, you'll have a fully functional airplane that you can fly. Once the airplane's running, there are a few things that I like to configure that I wish could be persisted from one flight to the other. I haven't found a way to do it though, so if anyone has any ideas, feel free to pop them in the comments below. The first thing I actually do is hide the yoke, and then I'm going to make sure that the barometric pressure is set properly so that I'm getting the right altitude. I do that by pressing the B button, but you can also use the knob on the primary flight display to change the barometric pressure to whatever it has to be. Pressing B just conveniently sets it for you to the right value, so I like using that instead. The next thing I like to do is I like to disable the little inset that's on the primary flight display here. It's really just a repeat of what you're seeing on the multifunction display. If you have a two-screen configuration, you would see this map on the second screen here, so again, it's kind of useless. So to disable it, all I do is I click on Inset and I turn it off. I also like to make the wind conditions visible on the primary flight display. So to do that, I go into the PFD options, I press wind, and I personally like option 2. It's going to very quickly tell me at a glance which direction the wind is blowing relative to my current heading, and it's going to tell me how fast it's blowing as well. Lastly, I also like to disable the synthetic terrain that you're seeing on the attitude indicator. Right now, what I'm seeing is effectively everything that's right in front of me. I don't find that very useful though, so I like to disable it by going into SynVis and then unchecking Syn Terrain, and then I end up with just a regular attitude indicator that's just blue and brown. From there, I just head back to the main menu. Next, I move to the autopilot settings. I like to hand fly the airplane all the way up to my cruise altitude, so the only thing that I set beforehand is the altitude that I want to level off at for cruise. I can do that with the knob right here, and by setting it ahead of time, the neat thing is if I decide to turn the autopilot on a little sooner than I actually expected, it's going to be ready to go, and all I'll have to do is hit the FLC mode, and it's going to continue my climb for me. To make sure that the autopilot also follows my flight path, I need to make sure that the CDI is set to use the GPS information. Right now you can see it's set to VOR, so I have to press the CDI key until it switches to GPS and it turns magenta. Once that's done, I actually spend a little bit of time refamiliarizing myself with what's on each one of the different panels of the airplane. You never know when you're going to need to switch something on quickly, and fooling around trying to figure out where the button is when you're in the middle of trying to do something isn't the right time to do it. On the multifunction display, I like to adjust the zoom level a little bit. When I'm on the ground getting ready for takeoff, I'm actually going to zoom all the way in so that I can see the taxiways a little bit better and how to get to where I'm going. As I'm taking off and I'm getting a little bit higher, I'm going to keep zooming out. And what I like on takeoff is somewhere around 5 to 10 nautical miles because you get a good visibility of the immediate area around you. And again, as I'm approaching my arrival airport, I'm going to zoom in a little bit just so I can have a better view of the airport that I'm going to be landing at. Finally, if I'm flying at altitude in a propeller-based plane and I need to adjust the mixture to make sure to have the most power possible, I might do that before taxiing, even though technically I should probably be doing it just before takeoff. Flying at altitude in a prop-based plane can be a little bit of a challenge, especially at those really high altitudes, so always make sure to set the mixture properly. It's going to give your airplane every chance it can to get off the ground and stay off the ground. And that's my whirlwind tour of how I prepare for a VFR flight. There can of course be a lot more things that go into it, like building a much more accurate route or flight plan, but for the most part I find my technique is sufficient. In the coming weeks, I'm going to be starting to cover how to fly with the instruments, so notably I'll be looking at instrument departures and arrivals and everything that goes into it. I hope you stick around for those, and as usual, if you do have questions or comments on anything that I've said in the video, feel free to put it in the comments below, and if you got some value out of this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe.